Hello everybody, welcome to Wine World TV, the best wine show anywhere. I'm your host, Mark Fusco. Now before we get started, make sure you're smashing that like button and subscribing to the channel. Every like and subscription helps build the channel. Even better, spread the word to your friends about the best wine show anywhere. All right, so I'm at my favorite wine bar in the world, which is High Street Wine Company. And they've been kind enough to allow us to use this little back area. And I'm with Jim Clarke, who is somebody that you should know. And he works with South African wines, and I've known him, but I've known him for quite a while through Texom, and he's in town, which I told him earlier this week, so glad that you're spending so much time in San Antonio. So he's in town, and I thought I'd get an interview. So Jim, who are you? How did you get, besides here, I know you flew here, but how did you get to what you do with Wines of South Africa?
Well, it's, it's very obvious. I got a degree in music. So I have a degree from Royal Academy of Music in London.
Wait, you do?
Yeah.
I do too. From UT.
Oh, okay.
I don't get cool. All right. Anyway, so
okay.
yeah, so Royal Academy.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah. So I have a degree in music composition. And after getting my degree, I lived in Europe for a few more years, and then decided to come back to the States. So the kind of music I was doing, which was kind of, I guess we would say, a fairly avant-garde, modern classical music.
Okay.
Well, most people become professors, but anyhow, I knew that I needed a day job, let's say, and like most people with performing arts degrees, when they come to New York City, you work in restaurants. And I was very lucky to work for a restaurant group that had a great wine training program. So I got interested in wine, and I thought, well, this is something that I enjoy. I love the diversity of wine. I love the history of wine. I've even gotten in to appreciate the science of wine, unusually for a musician. So I started studying to become a sommelier, and the Sommelier Association at that time had a competition where you wrote an essay about Rias Baixas. And I happened to win this competition. I won a trip to Rias Baixas, and I used what I knew about composing music actually to structure the essay. So it was actually a useful application of musical skills in a strange sort of way. But the fellow who organized that trip was a consultant who also worked with a few other categories, including South Africa. So he started introducing me to his other clients. And since I had won a writing competition, I had started writing about wine for a website called Star Chefs. And about a year later, I managed to get something in the New York Times, so I was able to start writing more broadly. And no one else was covering South Africa, so I kind of made it my beat. And around New York, I kind of, Jim's that South African sommelier. And I was like, oh no, I'm American, but I just discovered that no one else was talking about these wines. And so I continued to do that while working as a sommelier and writing and doing occasional things for Wines of South Africa, the company I work for now. And then in 2013, the restaurant I was at started doing the, you're our closing manager and our beverage director, but why don't you also do events? And I thought, okay, it's kind of time for me to get out of restaurants. And very fortunately, Wines of South Africa was ready to take someone on full time. And now I've been doing that for almost a dozen years.
Nice.
Yep.
So I thought we'd start out with a little bubbly. Now, we're not promoting any particular one winery. It just so happens that High Street Wine Company has a nice sparkler by the glass. So we've got some Grandbec Rosé. I'm figured we toast real quick.
Cheers.
Get that away. Cheers. Awesome.
Cheers.
Great stuff. Anyway, South Africa has a bunch of really cool wines. I've been lucky to taste a lot of them over the years. The two classes I went to, one was more consumer focused, the other was more trade, and we tasted a few different ones. Fantastic stuff. All right, so you started working for Wines of South Africa, and so now what is your role in that?
Well, the way our company is structured is for all the South African wine that's exported, for for every liter or gallon, they throw a nickel or whatever it is in the bucket, and it's a levy, and that's collected by the government. But then it's given to our organization, and then we have to divide it up among the various markets that we are trying to grow the South African presence in, including the U.S.
Okay.
So it doesn't amount to much. It's collected in rand, which is quite weak compared to the dollar.
Yes.
And if you talk to some of the other regional organizations, they have a lot of government support. Certainly the EU supports a lot of the EU wine regions. So you're looking at the entire team for Wines of South Africa for the U.S.
Awesome. And first of all, I was just going to say this: the Wine of South Africa website is phenomenal. Okay.
Very proud of our website.
You combine it with SAWIS. Right, the South African Wine Information System.
Well, I mean, we have our separate websites, but
Not that you can buy, but if you are looking up
Oh,
stuff,
I see, yeah.
use those in conjunction with each other. That you can get some really great information about South African wine. I've used it extensively for all of my notes and my studies. And another thing that I used is Jim Clarke's book. So when you've heard someone say they wrote the book on something, no, he literally wrote the book on Wines of South Africa. And that's one of the things we're going to focus on. And it's just what's called Wines of South Africa. So what was the impetus to do that?
Well, it's kind of surprised me. Because I am beholden to South Africa, I'm interested in South Africa's wine's growth in the world. Usually I don't write for magazines or publications about South African wine very much, because the editors will say, well, you've got skin in the game, maybe not. But the Classic Wine Library, which is a great series, has gone through a few different publishers, but it was certainly the series I turned to when I was studying wine back in the early 2000s. They, let's say, I think it was 2017 or so, they appointed a sommelier advisory board. And this is actually a Texas connection. So James Tidwell, founder of Texom, is on that board. And they started discussing, well, let's try to do this a bit more organized. Let's what regions haven't been covered in this series that we need to cover? And South Africa was definitely one of them. And knowing James very well for about a dozen years, he said, well, I think Jim is the obvious candidate to write the book, despite my position. And I think it is different when you're writing a book than when you're writing something editorial, which is editorial things are usually a little bit more service journalism. They're made to sell things, whereas the book is really, this is what's really, this is the state of South African wine, this is what's going on, these are the things. And especially for what I wanted to do with the book, which is, one of the first things I learned about wine books, one of my mentors, Greg Harrington, said, well, I know you're buying all these books. Just remember that a wine book is out of date the moment it comes out.
Yes.
Because wine industry's changed so much. So I really focused on the things that would make the book useful long term. I think producers change dramatically through, very quickly. I'm going to drop my focus on this variety, move to that variety, or what have you. But things like the terroir, the history, the industry structure, these are the things I really concentrated on the book, because those, I feel like, even if we don't update the, with a second edition in the next few years, it's still going to be valid what's in there.
Absolutely.
Maybe some of the stats will change, but the basic concepts are all going to be clear and evergreen.
Yeah, I agree with that. So, I also look at that when I do books, when I read books and collect books, I focus on what's going to be more universal. Obviously, certain things will change. Usually laws don't change terribly bad or terribly frequently, as far as like what's allowed and things like that. They tend to stay pretty static. But then when you have wine growing areas, South Africa, United States, we tend to add all these sub-appellations all the time.
Yep.
He has a fun quote in the book. It's about Robertson, which has 14 wards, about, wards are just like basically another flashcard for us. Yep. But that I can say that about TTB. Every year they've got 2 or 3 new appellations.
How many sub-AVAs do we need?
Yeah, do I really need to know all the sub-AVAs at Paso Robles? Probably not. And at some point, these are great for, so to talk about that, these AVAs, these appellations are great so that we have more specificity about the wines that we're drinking, and also helps us distinguish things one from the other. But at the end of the day, I think a lot of your average consumers, they just want the more general area is what's important to them. And I have found that not just with South Africa, with other parts of the world, that
you look at what's happening in Tuscany and Piedmont these days. They're just breaking it down, and it comes to a point where no one can remember the names.
Right.
And it's still more important that it says Chianti Classico on the label than knowing that it's from Rada or what have you.
So you have all these MGAs or anywhere else in the world that they're breaking these down. I think it's good in one way, but the other way I think it doesn't necessarily do anything. And at the end of the day, it's more stuff for me and anyone going for a certification to have to memorize. Anyway, so first of all, South Africa is large, right? it's a pretty big country, but not everywhere grows grapes for wine.
Yeah.
It's pretty much the Western Cape, even though we have the other capes, northern and eastern, have some vines there.
There's other provinces. The Western
Yeah.
Cape, which is the area, the southwest corner of South Africa, down by Cape Town, has a different climate than the rest of South Africa, and really than the rest of Africa until you get to the Mediterranean Ocean. So it really makes it the place to grow wine. There are, for some very peculiar historical reasons, some vineyards in the Northern Cape, but very little premium wine is produced up there. There's some interesting things happening. And then there are a couple what I would call tourist wineries in other parts of the Cape. There's a couple that are making some interesting things, but they're really challenged because oftentimes they're getting a lot of humidity during the growing season, or it's too hot and things like that. So you really have to find a very niche spot and then really work hard to make wine in some of those regions, whereas the Western Cape makes wine growing relatively easy, actually, because you've got these nice, warm, dry growing seasons. You've got this wind that limits disease pressure because the fungus spores never get a chance to settle on the grapes. So you just have to hope that you have enough water to get through the season and it doesn't get too hot.
Yeah. So correct me if I'm wrong. When the Cape means all the capes, when you mean specific, you'll say Western Cape typically, or does everyone just kind of go to the Cape, they just assume it's the Western Cape?
Yeah, within the wine industry, if someone says the Cape, they mean the Western Cape. I mean, it's
in general, like, So, and that's really what we're going to focus on as far as anything wine. It will be Western Cape.
Yeah.
You can deep dive if you want. There's not much to go to from what I saw outside the Western Cape.
I'm going to name two producers outside the Western Cape to look for.
Okay.
If you're in South Africa, because they don't have exports. And one is Abingdon, which is out in KwaZulu-Natal. It's up in the mountains, so it's very high elevation. And I've only tasted a couple things, but they were very promising. And I know, talking to South African Psalms, that they're very excited about what's happening out there.
All right.
And the other one is a producer called Luverland, which is up in that northern Cape, and they're doing some really cool stuff. They make, for example, so this is Cap Classique we're drinking.
Yes.
This is Chardonnay and Pinot, classic grapes. They're making one from Colombard, which is a
you mentioned
third most planted grape in South Africa, but mostly used for brandy and bulk wine. That's starting to become a thing. So they were imported for a hot second a few years ago. Maybe they'll find another importer. If you're looking for something really cool, importers, take it on. Yeah.
Colombard, we'll go down a brief rabbit hole. So Colombard, reason why it's planted so much is for brandy production. This is the same grape we use for cognac, Armagnac, and other brandies
Classic
in Europe.
Brandies, yep.
So there was a large brandy, and still is, right? A large brandy production in South Africa. We won't go too much farther unless you want to, but that's why Colombard has such a large planting relative to other grapes than you would think.
Yeah. So the wine, we've been doing wine in South Africa for 366 years. They've been doing brandy for 352 years.
Yeah.
So the first brandy made from Cape grapes was actually made on a ship in Table Bay. So we can't say it was made in South Africa or what is now South Africa, but it was made from South African grapes.
Because it was so dangerous to do it that we'll just let the sailors deal with it, right?
I guess sailors were just that eager to have spirits that they had to distill on the boat. I think of like the guys in MASH with their tent and their distill there.
Right? Absolutely, absolutely. Let's see. So I've already alluded to that the book covers, we talked about the book covers a lot of history, and I think that was one of the most things I was very excited about. Yes, you do go through each of the major areas and you highlight producers, which I think is also very valuable. But we kind of talked about history, and you've mentioned in the two classes I went to that you actually have a birth date effectively for South African wine.
We do, Groundhog Day, in fact. So it's an easy one for Americans to remember. So the Dutch first came to Cape Town, the first Europeans to settle in what is now South Africa in 1652. And the whole reason is because the Europeans had made an ecological mess of St. Helena Island out in the South Atlantic that had been their stopover point before they went around the southern tip of Africa to the Far East. So, it's the maritime spice route. And so in 1651, the person who would become the first commander of the Cape Colony, Jan van Riebeeck, was being shipped back to Holland to be yelled at for mismanagement. And the ship he was on stopped at where Cape Town is now to pick up some sailors who had been shipwrecked there, Dutch sailors. And he took a look around and he said, hey, there's fresh water here. There's actually some trees, which are pretty rare in that part of Africa. It's obviously a place to grow stuff. The local Khoi people or Khoisan people were actually friendly and raised cattle, so you could trade and get meat from them. So when he got back, he said, hey, we just made this stop, and this place looks great. we should set up our refreshment station there. And so in 1652, 3 ships arrived from Holland, with the Dutch East India Company, and set up what would eventually become Cape Town. And Jan van Riebeeck didn't have any winemaking experience, but he had visited Spain and south of France, so he knew what good vineyard land kind of looked like, and he thought that the Western Cape could do that. So he pressed them to send grape cuttings, which arrived in 1655, and then in his diary on Groundhog Day, 1659, he wrote, "Today, praise be to God, wine was made for the first time from Cape grapes." It was about 12 bottles from what we can suss out. We think the first grape varieties were Chenin Blanc, which is now South Africa's most important grape variety, Semillon, which had a huge heyday in the 19th century. In the 1820s, it was 92% of South Africa's vineyards. Perhaps Palomino, and then some sort of Muscat.
Okay.
So that was the birth of the South African wine industry.
All right. So speaking of Chenin Blanc, so in South Africa it's called Steen.
It was called
Steen, yeah.
There's a few. There are some producers who are kind of tipping their hat to history. A lot of today's producers are very interested in South African wine history, so they're really trying to revive some of these names a little bit. But they call it Chenin Blanc. They realized in 1963 they did the work and figured out that what they were calling Steen, which they thought was probably something related to Riesling, was actually Chenin.
Nice. And I can remember, my first inklings of South African wine when I was first interested in stuff, I would see Steen, and now you don't really see it anymore. Though I think Mulderbosch still uses the word Steen on their label. But it says Chenin Blanc, something Steen. Yeah.
So they very early on kind of got brand recognition for Steen op hout, which means Chenin on wood.
Yes.
And I think that wine doesn't have any new wood on it anymore because the styles have changed and they're not so interested in new oak as think people were in the 90s and early 2000s, but they've kept that brand name. So you see that on a few brands, and then you see people like Adi Badenhurst, who is a part of this generation that really wants to acknowledge some of the historical things. So he'll actually talk about Cinsault as Hermitage sometimes, for example, another grape with a different name.
Yeah.
So his wines often say Steen somewhere, but then they also say Chenin Blanc just so there's no confusion.
Yeah. So. And that's another one. Hermitage and Cinsault, that doesn't make any sense because Hermitage is Syrah. At least it is now. Maybe in the 1600s there was some Cinsault grown in Hermitage.
From what I understand, the term Hermitage was used very broadly for
a lot of things.
Stuff from the Rhone.
Yeah.
When they talk about Hermitaging Bordeaux, where they would secretly bring grapes from the Rhone over to Bordeaux, it wasn't necessarily Syrah. It was whatever they had that was going to beef it up. So
okay. Yeah, I joke with people that old school Bordeaux has Syrah in it.
Yep.
But all right, cool. So we've got some history. We know when things started. Cape Town was kind of the birthplace of wine. Let's talk Constantia because that was kind of the first, I guess, winery of note.
Yeah, certainly. Yeah. So one of Jan van Riebeeck's successors was a man named Simon van der Stel. And he was the 10th commander of the Cape Colony. He was appointed in 1685, excuse me, a few centuries off. He had winemaking experience. He actually owned vineyards back in the Netherlands. And one of the things they did is they said, okay, we're going to give you this huge property, and you're going to grow all sorts of things on it and teach all these settlers to how to grow things properly, so that it was kind of a quality control sort of thing. And for example, he actually started saying, okay, you can't harvest before I say you can harvest, because people were, I don't want to have to deal with the grapes getting rotten, so I'm just going to harvest them now, even if I don't know if they're ready or not, but it's good enough for me, And then the wines were very acidic and thin and unpleasant. So he said, no harvesting before I announce the harvest date. He insisted on barrel cleanliness. Before that, they would literally take a barrel that had been used for pickling and then say, okay, it's harvest season, empty that out so we can use it for wine. And you can imagine the disastrous sort of bugs and chemical, acidity and things that's sitting around in a pickle barrel that aren't going to be good for wine. So he really raised the bar, but in particular for his property, he passed away in 1712. And then the property, started getting divided up as people sold off different bits. But one part of the property was making a wine. It was a Muscat late harvest wine. No botrytis, not fortified, just hanging on the vine. So it concentrated, all the sugars, the flavors, and the acidity. And this wine became so popular in Europe that there were fraudulent versions being sold as early as 1740 in London. We know that when Louis XVI was marched off to the guillotine, he had more Constantia wine in his cellar than he had Burgundy or Champagne or Bordeaux. So it really was the talk of Europe, and it was the first great international sweet wine. Tokai had not exploded onto the scene yet, so Terran was not really a thing yet. So to have a wine that was opulently sweet like this was brand new. You know, we get so much sugar in our lives that we just take sweetness for granted. But we have to remember that until, well, really sugar wasn't even a thing in Europe until after the Columbian exchange.
Right.
So even that, you know, so sweet was still a new thing, and certainly a new thing in wine, because if you normally, if you have a small amount of sweetness, they didn't have a way to get the yeast out, so it was going to re-ferment in the bottle and it would become dry. This is so much sugar that the yeast is like, even the yeast gives up on it. It's like so it's stable. So
yeah. And I mean, and because of all that sugar, it was able to survive the trip.
Yeah. Now there were the was it fortified debate that does come up a lot.
True that, yeah.
Because there were exporters, or people would buy a barrel and then they say, hey, I'm going to send this all the way back home to London. I'm going to fortify it just to be sure. So there were there have been samples found that were fortified, but we think the practice at most of the wineries was not to fortify.
And Dutch really were the first ones to do that for preservation.
Yeah.
The fortified,
well, yeah,
fortified
I mean,
wines.
With the Dutch influence, I mean, the whole reason we call brandy is because it comes from Brandwijn, burnt wine, in Dutch. So that they really pioneered that technology, and then using it to blend back with the wines in port and things like that.
Cool.
So.
And Constantia over the years has grown and shrunk and been split up and owned by a bunch of different people. But we have two, I would say, main ones, but then we have like sort of like four total.
There's five total.
Five total use
Klein
Constantia.
Constantia, Constantia Eetzig, Betenverwachting, and
Yeah, I don't remember the fifth one.
I always forget.
I'll have it. We'll have a list. We'll have the list.
Yeah. But there's about a dozen. There's a dozen wine estates in the Constantia region now. So there are parts of that valley that weren't part of the original estate, but are making wine in Constantia now.
So then we go from Cape Town in that area, and then we move into Stellenbosch.
Yeah.
That was our next migration. Is there, right?
Yeah. I mean, that was all happening at the same time.
Same time, yeah.
But the first vineyards were certainly in Cape Town. The first vineyards would have been actually right in the middle, where there's a place called the Company Gardens, which is a public park.
Yeah.
And that didn't work because it got flooded every year. So they then moved it around the hill to an area that's now all suburbs. There was an area called, there was actually an estate called Rustenburg, not affiliated with the Rustenburg in Stellenbosch.
Okay.
That, aside from about 14 rows of vines at a place called the Vineyard Hotel, that area doesn't have any vines anymore. It's suburbs.
Okay.
And then really Constantia has suburbs kind of surrounding it.
Right, yeah.
But farmers were settling Stellenbosch in the 1680s. Stellenbosch is named for Simon van der Stel, so the guy who founded Constantia. So it basically means his woods.
Right,
so,
yeah.
Yeah.
And then we had the
Huguenots.
The Huguenots coming in, and so French Protestants, if I remember correctly.
That's right.
Right, and something with one of the Louis.
1685.
Yeah.
Louis the
14th.
I guess the 13th.
13th. Okay.
One of them revoked the Edict of Nantes, and that was an edict of religious toleration. So suddenly the Huguenots were finding they were under pressure from the Catholic majority again, and they turned to the Dutch. The Dutch were also a Protestant background, and the Dutch said, "Well, we've got this new colony. You're welcome to go there if you like." And we know that between 1688 and 1691, 201, at least on the books, 201 French Huguenots came to the colony, and they said, "Okay, well, we're going to put you a little bit." So the Dutch were in Stellenbosch. Stellenbosch, you could take your ox cart and get to Cape Town in a day. They kind of put the French a little bit further out, and to an area that at the time was called Drachenstein Valley. Now we call it Franschhoek. It means French corner because there were so many French settlers there. And 201 doesn't sound like a lot of people, but the total population of European descent in 1691 was 800. So suddenly 1/4 of them are French, and some of these people were from wine-growing areas. Some of them brought cuttings, and you can kind of see they were some of the early big successes. And you can see as farms change hands, like the de Villiers, it was a French family, 3 brothers, and suddenly they owned estates. They started buying estates in Stellenbosch too, and so they definitely brought some winemaking talent new grape varieties and things to the Cape.
Okay.
Yeah.
And those were the three first really major areas as far as historical.
Yeah. Well,
And
we
Parle
would
also,
Parle,
yeah.
Parle would have been part of that. The Franschhoek and Parle weren't quite as divided. I mean, still it's kind of hard to tell for the outer end of Franschhoek Valley when you've actually passed into Parle. There's no, it's not a clear barrier the way it is between Stellenbosch and those other areas.
Right. Okay. So you mentioned we were kind of briefly talking about climate and wind. So we have a specific wind that is very beneficial, right?
I think the wind is the most defining thing about the kind of growing, about why this is a great region to grow wine, and it's the Cape Doctor. And it's caused because there's a high pressure system that sits out over the South Atlantic during the winter. But as the southern hemisphere warms up, it allows it to kind of slip south, and then it actually moves and sets up to the southeast of the southern tip of Africa. So it's this huge high pressure system, all this air, just sitting on top of the earth, looking for a place to go. And the water's quite cold because it's coming from the south, from Antarctica. It's this counterclockwise current, and the air mass that's over the land heats up faster than the air mass over the water. So as the air over the land heats up, it creates this gap. And then that high pressure system has a place to go. And that shoots up from the southeast. And this is what keeps it, certainly what keeps it dry, because generally this is a high pressure. So high pressure means, it's pushing all the stormy weather out to the side. Every once in a while, they get what they call a black southeaster, where a little storm system gets kind of and gets caught in it, and then it gets sweeps across, and those can actually be quite violent.
Okay.
But generally this wind and that pattern means that you have what is the Mediterranean climate, which doesn't just mean that it's nice and beautiful. It means cool, wet winters, and then long, dry spring, summer, fall growing season.
Yeah.
So as long as you have a way to capture the water that comes in the winters, you have it for your vines, either in the soil or in a reservoir or something like that. It's a great place to grow grapes.
Okay. So one of the things about this, so cool currents are usually not great for actually having precipitation. Warm currents are usually better for precipitation.
Yep.
So you talked about if you can collect your water, and so somewhat recently there was a drought crisis.
Yes.
In Cape Town specifically.
The Western Cape.
Western Cape,
Yeah.
but it got bad in Cape Town.
That was So in 2018. So the drought was from 2015 to 2018. In 2018, we had this day zero threat where they were actually going to not have water in Cape Town. At that point, you would have had to every day go to a collection point, and you would have gotten one whatever for your household.
Whatever your ration
is.
Yeah,
whatever your ration is. So that didn't happen. Fortunately, they didn't get that far. It's climate change.
Yeah.
So, but on the other hand, the past two our summers, their winters,
Yeah.
they've had so much rain that they've had dams break.
Oh wow.
And they've actually had to release water from the reservoir so they wouldn't overflow in some places.
Yeah.
So it's that again. It's not a consistent thing with climate change. It means more extremes.
Exactly. Yeah.
So in the long run, obviously, water use is going to be a problem or a challenge in the Cape. A lot of it, some of it's climate change. The other thing is the Western Cape is the most vibrant economic corner of South Africa. So you have a lot of people moving from other parts of South Africa, even from other parts of Africa, coming there looking for work. So the residential demands for water are really starting to fight with the agricultural demands.
right.
So that's a big challenge.
Sounds like some other places in the world,
Yeah.
United States
Yeah.
specifically.
Yep.
But you mentioned something about because of what was going on from 15 to 18 and was with agriculture having to limit its use of water. Now it's kind of like, well, now we know you don't need as much.
Yeah. So
And this is a good thing. We're not trying to be like mean about it,
right. Well, there's always it takes a lot of water to make wine.
Yes.
It's a lot of cleaning. It's a lot of but the industry has a sustainability program, and 96% of the industry is certified sustainable. And you'll see this when you look at there's a seal that you see on the bottleneck, and if it has this little stylized protea, which is the national flower of South Africa, then it's certified sustainable. And that means every single vineyard and the winery itself have been certified and audited for this process. And they introduced that in 1998, which I think is really forward-thinking.
Yes.
We talk a lot about sustainability today, but for a long time, I feel like I've been talking about, they've got sustainable. People are like, yeah, but is it organic or is it this? I'm like, sustainable is the most important thing, because that's the thing that means you're going to stay in business. Organic is no guarantee of staying in business. But so they introduced it in '98, and they just keep tightening, refining it. So if they go through 3 years discovering that, you can actually get by with using less water, well, let's write that into the rules. So then people don't feel like, well, I'm going to splash out and waste water now. We know we know that what we were doing before, this was maybe wasteful. Now we don't have to do that anymore. Now it's part of the rules.
Yeah, I mean, they were one of the first ones. Like New Zealand is a little bit afterwards.
I believe so.
And maybe a couple years later, maybe like 2000. And then Lodi rules, or what we call Lodi rules now, I think started about the same time. But that's it.
Yeah.
And like you mentioned, Lodi is Lodi. Right?
Yeah.
It's not a statewide or a nationwide thing. There's even talked about, I went to, we have a symposium here every year for the Hill Country in January. And last year, not this year in 25, but 24, sustainability was a subject. They brought somebody in from New York to talk about it. And you have kind of two competing groups that want to write a sustainability thing, and I kind of mentioned, well, I mean, you can write one for all of Texas, but the way most of the United States ones are is more specific to your region. But I also said, you may want to look at some of these organizations, and I probably mentioned South Africa and New Zealand because they're more nationwide type of programs.
It's very difficult to create a sustainability program that will work for a lot of different growing conditions.
Yeah.
So the South Africa one is kind of a point system. So like if you're in a winery where you have higher disease pressure, Elgin, for example, tends to get more moisture during the growing season. Elgin is one of those places. They were able to donate 9 days worth of water to the city of Cape Town during that drought, because they've got this catchment system and they have a lot of water. So, but when you have that during growing season, then you have higher disease pressure. So some of the vineyards there find it more necessary to use a little bit more, spraying in the vineyards and things like that. So if they're doing that, on the other hand, then they can then compensate because they don't have the problems with high temperatures. It's the coolest climate growing region in South Africa. So they can kind of balance out the different things. And it's a very rigorous system. And it also, like, if you want to plant a grape that's not suitable for a certain area, you're like, I think this is going to work, I want to grow this kind of grape. And they say, well, this isn't really a good region for growing that grape. That grape needs, for example, a lot of water.
Yeah.
They're going to say, you're going to have to say, you have to prove that you're going to be able to farm it that way. So it's right from the beginning of the vineyards. It's not just on the annual basis. So
and I thought that was really impressive. Having the so it's called the IPW.
Integrated Production of Wine.
Yeah, integrated production of wine. Yes, not integrated pest, not IPM, integrated pest management, which can be part of sustainability and biodynamics and all that. So we got that, and then. I really want to talk, because I know you've got something to do soon. We're not quite up there. We're not quite at that time yet. But
we're doing good.
I think one of the things that was most impressive, and I think was really important with your book, was really talking about apartheid. And I have 3 notes: apartheid, the DOP system, and the broad-based Black economic empowerment. They're all kind of related, and they were probably in the same section of your book.
Yeah.
And I thought that was a really great section.
I'm really proud of that section. And when they put together the Classic Wine Library, the reader, originally they asked me about using the history section, and I said, I'm very proud of that. That's fine. But what about this, about the social aspects?
Yes.
Because no one else has been right. No one puts that in their wine books. And I think now that's changing. So the series just published Elaine Chuckin-Brown's thing on California, and I believe she's talking about Mexican workers and all that sort of thing in a way that's really shows everything about the industry.
Yeah.
For South Africa, I think it was just an obvious thing with the history of apartheid and all the efforts to bring Black people and people who suffered under apartheid into ownership and positions of authority within the wine industry is just terribly important, and it's been very difficult.
Yeah.
A lot of the difficulty focuses on the fact that the South African government focuses on land ownership. Worldwide, the least profitable part of being in the wine industry is to own a vineyard and not do anything else with it. I mean, there's people who make money on it, but it's the hardest part. And right now in South Africa, 50% of the people who are growers, not winemakers, but just they grow, they're breaking even or losing money. So with these programs, especially in the 90s, the workers would be able to form a trust and then say, okay, then we get a grant from the government, we're going to buy a piece of land, and then we can sell the grapes. Again, you're putting people into you're setting them up for failure.
Right.
And so the industry really worked very hard on a kind of a one-by-one basis to adapt these programs. One of my favorite examples is a company called Mirlist, and they helped their workers and workers at Ken Forrester's farm and Overcouth, so 3 nearby farms, to form a trust, and they were able to buy a piece of land. And there's some vineyards there, and they sell some grapes. But more importantly, they built a logistics center.
Yes.
Gee, big warehouse. Logistics is the profitable part of the wine industry. Again, it's pretty consistent worldwide. Look at how our distributors do here. Yeah. And it's great because it's very low capital intensive. You have to build the storage place, and you've got to have good air conditioning. But you don't need a winery. You don't need all the barrels that have to renew every year and this sort of thing. So they were able to get a solid financial footing. And now they are making their own wine, but they've got the capital to do that because of having set up the logistics center.
Yeah. So and then there's I mentioned there was a DOP system, and it was, so that was something that took a while, but it is officially.
Oh, it's long gone.
Okay.
Yeah, let's speak.
Yes, it's long gone. But
Yeah.
it was. So the basic idea was part of your pay was in wine.
Yeah.
But that's not the only thing. You could do that. Other industries could do something similar. It's just that this was a particularly problematic, I would say.
Well, it's led to a lot of kind of multi-generational alcoholism problems. So there's some great projects trying to address both education. One of the leaders there is the Pebbles Project, which is focused on the kids, and because you've got to cut that off at a generational point. Yes, you can help people who already suffer, but if you can stop it before the kids are even starting to drink, much better, right? Yeah. So Pebbles Project is one of our leading, and a lot of a lot of the wineries support that. For example, I actually did a thing in Chicago a couple of months ago where we were raising money for the Pebbles Project with the wine tasting and things, and so it's a really negative legacy, but one that industry is working hard at, and that's something where they are working very well with the government together, because obviously the government's on the same page on that one.
Okay.
Yeah.
Cool. What else? So we talked about in both the classes, you kind of just give us an overview of a bunch of different grapes. So Chenin Blanc, we've already mentioned, is kind of the signature grape, if you will. But it's not like say New Zealand, where it's like all Sauvignon Blanc grown, right?
Yeah, so New Zealand, 75% of their vineyards are Sauvignon Blanc. Chenin is our most planted grape. It's 18.4% of our vineyards. So the nature of the Cape with the mountains and the different aspects and exposures means that there isn't, even within Stellenbosch, we often say Stellenbosch is cab country. We compare it to Napa. The diversity of grape planting is much more diverse than it is for Napa, because it depends on where you are in the water, and it's not shaped like a narrow valley, so a lot more variables, and you can have, Sauvignon Blanc if you're close to the water, and then if you're away from the water, maybe you're going Cab or Pinotage somewhere in a warmer section, but it's still Stellenbosch, So. And
you had an example of how you have Cab and
Riesling. Just a few hundred yards from each other, because one is facing south and getting that cool wind, the southeast wind coming into it, and facing south means you're facing away from the sun, in the southern hemisphere at least, and then on the north side of the hill you might have Cabernet, because that's facing north and less exposed to that wind, and you want more ripeness, or your grape needs more ripeness. Yes.
Absolutely. And then, of course, we can't not talk about South Africa without talking about Pinotage. Okay.
Celebrating his birthday, so very appropriate. Yeah.
So tell us what Pinotage is and how it came to be.
So Pinotage was a cross developed by Professor Abraham Perold at the University of Stellenbosch 100 years ago. In theory, we know he loved Pinot Noir. He actually had brought the first cuttings of Pinot Noir to South Africa, and Cinsault was the most planted grape at that time, and did and does very well in the Cape. So in theory, he crossed them to hopefully get the organoleptic qualities of Pinot Noir, but something that would grow well in the Western Cape.
Okay.
Grapes are very genetically complex, so it didn't really add up the same way. And it's a very grape breeding is these days very sophisticated. This was a very simplistic crossing. Anyhow, the first commercial example came out in 1961. It's the 1959 Lanzerac, and there were a couple of people kind of specializing in it, but it's never dominated the way we tend to think of it dominating. It was never the most planted red variety, for example. That's once Cinsault faded out of the picture, that's been Cabernet as the dominant red grape. However, it really became part of the marketing in the 1990s. And if you look at some of the people who had experience with it, like Constantia, so Constantia, 1991, the winemaker wins the best winemaker in the world for at the International Wine and Spirits competition for his 1989 Pinotage, his Breyers-Truder at Constantia. Well, 1991 is the year that the embargoes fell because apartheid was being disassembled, and so suddenly South Africa could start exporting. So the very year the world says, South Africa, you can export your wines, they say, and this is the best. So a lot of people jumped on board. A lot of people didn't have experience making red wine. In 1990, 80% of South Africa's vineyards were planted to white grapes. So you had a lot of rough and ready Pinotage. And now that's in the past. We know how to make Pinotage properly, we know how to grow it properly, we know where it grows well. Now that we can talk about Pinotage like we talk about other wines, and we can talk about winemaking style. Some people are really, a lot of the younger winemakers in particular, are going for this less extracted, very fresh style that really looks toward the Cinsault and Pinot Noir parentage to make a fresh red wine. And other people are doing the more classic style, more structured wine, a wine made for aging, which is what Constantia was historically known for. So we've got this style, like now the question is, what is the style of the Pinotage? And also, what is the terroir? And I think you figured out how to grow a grape when you can talk about terroir expression. So it's reached the point where I can taste a Pinotage and not know what it is and say, I bet that's going on shale soils, or I bet that's going on granitic soils, to name the two most common types. And then, other things like, oh, is it a cool climate, is it a hot climate, whatever. But we can actually have terroir conversations, and we've done tastings with 6 or 8 different wines from different terroir combinations and really been able to illustrate this for sommeliers and wine writers and things like that.
Okay, and you mentioned something about the fermentation. I think it's the fermentation process that they figured out how to make it so we don't have any negative aromas and flavors coming from it. That's
really important. A lot of the negative descriptors that you heard about Pinotage previously none of these are inherent to the grape. They are the results of winemaking choices. And a lot of it was because the winemaking choices, the how to make red wine book for South Africa was traditionally based around Cabernet Sauvignon. And if you make Cabernet Sauvignon you make Pinotage the way you make Cabernet Sauvignon, you're asking for trouble. The simple example I think I gave the other day is if you harvest the two of them at the same sugar levels. The Cabernet will take about a week to ferment to dryness. The Pinotage, if you let it, could ferment to dryness in 24 or 48 hours. And when yeast has that kind of party and ferments that fast, it creates all sorts of off aromas. So a lot of the mercaptans, so the burnt rubber things that you hear about in these old Pinotage, it's because they weren't controlling that speed of fermentation. Pinotage is really nutrient rich. It is just great for the yeast. And then it's also a little bit low acid. So especially has a lot of malic acid. So after it goes through malolactic fermentation and it goes to barrel, you still have all these nutrients floating around. And yeast is not the only microbe that loves nutrients. So then you can get Brettanomyces and other aromas. I think Band-Aid would be a typical tasting note from there, which we now know is Brettanomyces. So you got that hygiene. In some cases, it's acidification. Acidification is a valuable tool for some wines. But it's all winemaking things, and once you know how to do that you can put those things in the past.
Yeah, so. And I'll say, I've had some Pinotages over the years, and it's gotten way better. And you can make Pinotages that are in a more value-driven price point that are going to taste pretty good. I don't think a lot of, at least the producers I've seen here, we don't see a lot of that. But Pinotage as a category tends to be, a fairly pricey wine, at least here. I'm not sure.
Yeah, I think that's fair to say. I think a good way to think about it is when one of its parents is Pinot Noir. How hard is it to find a good, cheap Pinot Noir?
It can be difficult.
Yeah, a $10 or $15 Pinot Noir, and it's the nature of the grape that it's hard to. If you're going to make it, you've got to be serious about it, and it takes a certain amount of investment in terms of what you do in the vineyards and what you do in the winery. So you have to charge more for it.
Yeah.
But it's very interesting to look at the numbers of all the major different wine styles and grape varieties that we track as far as imports coming into the States. Pinotage commands the highest average price.
Yeah.
So people are willing to pay for it because it is coming in and doing well.
Absolutely. I like your Pinot Noir analogy because yes, you can find pretty decent. I mean, it's not life-changing wine, but you can find some pretty decent Pinot Noir that's serviceable. That's going to be under $20. Typically, those are coming from larger wineries that have a lot of economies of scale, so they can absorb some of this stuff and all that. But if I try to sit there and make that $15 Pinot Noir, I probably couldn't. I'd probably have to charge $30 for it. And vine made, it's probably not that good.
When I was at sommelier, the great challenge for the wine list was to find the Pinot Noir that I can do by the glass and like be proud of.
Right. Exactly. I think I've hit all the highlights of what you were talking about. The two classes I went to. Is there anything that we want to like highlight, or maybe certain grapes that you want maybe they're on the lookout for besides the Colombard, or if there are any regions? I know we didn't really talk about Swartland, but I know that has a good history of South African wine.
Yeah, I think so. What happened in the Swartland, where this idea of really finding the great vineyards, pulling them out of the co-op system, and and making wine from them, so that what were great grapes that were being lost into big blends is not not a thing anymore.
Yeah.
Still a thing, but less of a thing. Let's say is really key. That started around 2007, 2008 was the Swartland Revolution that started.
Yeah.
And that spread to the rest of the Cape. But I think what's the cutting edge of things is really a lot of the young winemakers, even if they're doing their own brand or they're working for somebody else, they're really looking back. So a lot of things changed in the 90s, post-apartheid, not because of, indirectly because of the end of apartheid, but we went from 80% white grapes to 55. So there's a lot of replantings, things like that. And so looking back, and like Cinsault got cast aside as this worthless grape, and it's less than 2% of South Africa's vineyards, having been the most planted grape once. It is now a really exciting part of South Africa, because we've gone from maybe 2 varietal Cinsauts available in the market to over 100. As people look back at this grape and say, well, it was very important back then. Maybe we should take another look at it. And that's actually the key to the Chenin story. A lot of people thought Chenin was always just for the big sweet blends that they used to do back in the 60s and 70s, just like they did in California. And now they're, but if you don't make it that way, again, it's how do you handle it in the vineyard? How do you make it in the winery? You don't have to make a cheap wine with it just because someone used to.
Right.
And so we're really rediscovering a lot of historical little pockets, either regionally speaking, or varieties like Cinsault. We mentioned the Colombard story with the Cap Classique. So that exploration of South African wine history and kind of recapturing some babies that were thrown out with the bathwater in the 90s.
Okay. There's one story I do want him to talk about, not necessarily because we necessarily need to focus on any particular winery, but in his book it was very moving and touching. Samantha O'Keefe. Let's talk about that.
A great American connection. So Samantha is from Los Angeles and worked in TV, and actually fell in love with South Africa because she was working with Desmond Tutu back while apartheid was ending. So fell in love with the country. Moved to South Africa in the early 2000s, and talked to a few people, and bought this vineyard way out in the middle of nowhere. It's in this area that's called the Cape South Coast, which is one of our cooler climate areas, and it's up on the edge of these mountains. And she and her husband parted ways. She had two little boys, and was kind of out on her own, trying to make wine there, and really struggling. And then fortunately, someone noticed. Neil Martin, actually, now at the time he was with Wine Advocate, I think. Now he's with Vinous, and he called them out, and so she was able to find importers and start selling. Built it up. Then in 2017 or 2018, fire came over the hill, destroyed the winery, destroyed a lot of the vineyards, and the industry, while the fire was still burning, the industry rallied around her. It was really, it was tragic but heartwarming at the same time. People were donating grapes so she could still harvest something that vintage and have, so be able to keep cash flow and stay in business. And she's back from that again. The wines are fantastic, and in fact, she's actually not only was she invited to join a group called the Cape Winemakers Guild, which is it's not all of the best South African winemakers, because some kind of take part and then they kind of graduate out of it, but it's a core group that is dedicated to making great wine in South Africa. And it's not wineries, it's winemakers. So if a winemaker moves, from one winery to another, they stay a member, and they've got a great thing like the Protégé program, where they raise money to get people who usually from previously disadvantaged groups, so black people who want to work in the wine industry, so they can work as winemakers through this Protégé program. She is not just a member, she's actually the chairperson right now.
Cool.
So it's very interesting to see this a country that actually had been quite closed off historically, and now the openness, accepting an American in, but also listening to how winemakers help each other in South Africa. not just in tragic situations like that, but even other people. It's like, hey, I've got this, I'm working with Colombard and I'm having a stuck vintage. They know they can call some other guy who's got some more experience with a grape or girl, and they share that information. And that wasn't always the case. And I think that's where a lot of the growth in South Africa is coming, is that they're all in it together and they know it. Yeah.
So Samantha's wine is called Lismore, right?
Yes, thank you.
Lismore. Yeah. And when I read the story, I was like, man, I got to try this wine. And then I kind of forgot about it. And then you were the first day you were doing it. I looked at the name and it didn't ring a bell on the list. And then you said something like, there's an American connection. I was like, wait a minute, I think I know which one you're talking about. There was a couple wines that American Connection. I already knew one of them, but you weren't at that wine yet. So I was like, wait a minute, I know this one. I turned to the person next to me and I go, hey, I think this is the one with the winery burnt down. So I was super excited to be able to try that wine. So thank you for including that in actually both tastings. And it was fantastic. Chardonnay is one of those wines that is like, yeah, okay, whatever for me for a lot of times, but that was a really well-made Chardonnay, and I was very pleased with it. Yeah. So
I think Chardonnay in South Africa is a really exciting spot. It's what consistently I get a lot of people. Oh, I don't normally drink Chardonnay, but I love this one. And be it the Lismore or any other, there's a number of other examples I could give, and I think it's a really exciting grape in South Africa.
Yeah. So I was very excited. So, and then all the other wines you brought, I probably have pictures of lists and pictures of bottles somewhere maybe along the line I'm putting up right now. So you had a great collection for us to taste.
I have to thank the importers for that. Our importers are really, you don't invest in South Africa unless you believe in it. So. Yeah. I really appreciate their support and providing so that when I show, I get to show South Africa's best.
Cool. He's got to get going here pretty soon. He's got an event at 6:30. It's right about 6 o'clock now. So, I mean, I can sit and chat with Jim all day long, but he's got work to do. I don't. But Jim, unless there's something that we maybe didn't cover that you want to talk about, we can wrap this up.
I will say the one thing that frustrates me in the U.S., and I know it frustrates people who love South African wine beyond myself, is that we still have a lot of retailers who don't carry enough of it. So if you're interested in these wines, if you have these wines and you already believe in them, pester your retailers. Go into the shop and say, where's your South Africa section? Because we need them to know that people are looking for the wines. They know people are looking for Argentine Malbec. That's a established thing.
Right.
But I don't think they've caught on that there's a lot of people wandering around looking for South African wines who are eager to have them.
Yeah. And
can't.
Nothing is Chenin Blanc and or Pinotage, but they make other wines besides that.
Most planted grapes. You have Cabernet Sauvignon, you have Shiraz, you have Sauvignon Blancs.
Yeah.
Chardonnay we mentioned. So it's one of the things that keeps me in my job is the fact that there's so many different things, and I don't get bored because not only these major categories, but then if you told me 12 years ago that I'd be talking so much about Cinsault, I would never have guessed.
Right, exactly. Yeah. So there's so many things that were in his two classes that we haven't even touched upon. But yeah, just do yourself a favor, check out South African wines. There are some really great things out there. Even I'm guilty of not reviewing a lot of South African wines. It's more about what shows up on my doorstep, what people who send me emails and I say yes or no to, and also is what's in the market. Sometimes it's just there isn't that much. I don't go out and about to buy stuff as like I used to, but as far as what's out in the market, I have been lucky to try a lot of fantastic South African wines. I actually many years ago, one of my followers sent me some Tokara actually.
Oh, nice.
So fantastic, and I met them at Provine of all places. I implore you to seek out South African wine. They have some great stuff out there, and it's great stuff. I'll just put it that way.
Yep.
Cool. Well, Jim, thanks a lot.
Thank you very much.
Spend some time with me. Folks, it's going to wrap it up. As always, make sure you click like and subscribe, and tell your friends about it, and we will see you next time. And cheers.
Cheers.
All right.